This is Ed Friedman, Chair of Friends of Merrymeeting Bay. I want to thank you all for coming. This is the first time we've ever tried this, so I beg your forgiveness to start with for any glitches that happen. And I want to thank Martha Spees for making this possible. You see her, I think, up on your screen there on the upper right. And of course, thank our speaker, Doug Bogan, for coming and kicking the series off this year. The series has run about 24 years now. And due to COVID, this is the first year we haven't been doing it in person. So we'll see how it goes and hope it goes well. It's an abbreviated series this year, running January through May, second Wednesday of each month. And probably most of you have seen the schedule. It's on our Friends of Merrymeeting Bay website, fomb.org. But our next event in February 10th will be Searching for Smelt, Citizen Science and Maine's Sea Run Fishes, with a couple of women from Maine Department of Marine Resources, Claire Enterline and Danielle Frechette. So that should be good. And a few people have brought to my attention recently that the bay is not frozen, and it should be. And so the smelt fishing is probably not so great at the moment, at least in a shack. So a little bit about Friends of Merrymeeting Bay, and then I'm going to do a little, maybe I'll do the Zoom protocol first, and then a little bit about us, and then I'll introduce our speaker. For those of you that haven't Zoomed around, and I'm probably the only one that hasn't done much of it, but you probably see Martha in the upper right there. And above her, there's a couple little icons. There's her hand there. A little icon will reduce her, I think, right out of there. One little icon next to that shows the active speaker. The one with the double rectangle shows all of us. And then the one with all the dots shows, I don't know what that shows, a different format. But so anyway, you can mess with that sometimes depending on what's happening. Having a video, having an image there of the speaker may block what's on the slide. So you can either reduce it, or you can grab the slide up in the gray margin and move that image of a person around the screen kind of anywhere you want, as far as I can tell. As Martha said, everyone's muted. If you've got a question, use the chat box down in the bottom center. You click on that and you'll see an opportunity to write in a question. Then you hit enter and it sends. And at the end, Martha and her husband, Arthur, who I also thank, is helping field those questions. And either they'll pose them to Doug or they'll unmute you, depending on how you're on board with us. I don't know if anyone's on the phone or not, and we'll go from there. So all that being said, quick bit about Friends of Merrymeeting Bay. And remember, well, everyone's unmuted by, everyone is muted by Martha. So this shouldn't be a problem. If by some chance someone is unmuted and the phone starts ringing, make sure you hit the mute button or turn your phone off or something. We're a unique group in that we take a holistic approach to protecting the Bay and the Gulf of Maine. And we do that through research, advocacy. We are a land trust, and we have an active education program, considerably more active before COVID hit. So this is part of it, but with education, we have a history of doing a lot with kids in elementary schools, focusing on hands-on work. Either in school or at a couple of times a year. We have a Bay Day where they're out in the field getting muddy and counting plants and looking at birds and doing real archaeology digs and stuff. So we hope to get back to that at some point. Some examples of research. We've done a very extensive circulation study of the Bay. That was a 4-year study. The Bay is a very complicated soup bowl with a very narrow entrance or exit via the Kennebec River, 6 rivers joining the Bay. And draining about 40% of Maine. So we learned a lot from that. We've looked at historical data using historical aerial photography, looking at vegetation and land use changes over time. And we continue to do updates on that. We've done some great archaeology I don't know when I got muted. Martha, I didn't do anything.
We've done some great archaeology, is where you left off.
Say again?
We've done some great archaeology.
So I'm still not understanding you. Sorry about that. But we're uh, we do land conservation work. We're a land trust. We've protected about 1,500 acres of land around the bay, and about 11, 12 miles of shoreline. Most recently, Centers Point, with the help of the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, the largest unprotected piece of land on the bay, and that's in Bodenham, abutting a wildlife management area and abutting easement land we have. And we've done some great advocacy over the years, and currently working again on trying to upgrade the lower Androscoggin River from a Class C, which is the lowest grade possible with the state, to a Class B, which is where the data have told us it's testing at for years. And this will be a great thing if we could do it this year. We upgrade because once you upgrade, it's very difficult to backslide. Got to go through a big stink with the EPA to do that. And this would be a good year to do it, being the 50th anniversary of Muskie's Clean Water Act. And for those that don't know it, the Androscoggin was the poster child for that act. So it would be a fitting kind of bookend for that. We're also in the middle of a lawsuit against Central Maine Power for the unnecessary tower lighting out at the chops where the bay empties out, and as a partial alternative to lighting, inundating everyone with radio frequency radiation. That again is unnecessary totally. So we're bringing the suit under nuisance law. We do a lot with fish passage as well, and have had various lawsuits dealing with that over the years. So much of what we do has to do with, or is possible because of volunteers. So if you're not a member, please consider joining us and volunteering for some aspect of what we do. We actually need 2 or 3 water quality monitors for this next season. So that would be really a quick jump into my mind need of ours. So in Bath and up in the Gardner and Hollowell area. So, all right, without further ado, our speaker tonight, Doug Bogan, is Executive Director of the Seacoast Anti-Pollution League, which I hope he'll say a few words about. Doug's been an environmental organizer and advocate for over 30 years with his expertise in the field of environmental science and education. He has extensive knowledge of the history of the energy industry and a comprehensive understanding of the regulatory processes. Doug's able to develop real-world community-based solutions to our most challenging environmental issues. In addition to his work at the Seacoast League, Doug's a founding member of the Seacoast Peace Response and Portsmouth Severodvinsk connection, Russian sister city, I'm going to guess. He was program director of the Seacoast Area Renewable Energy Initiative, 2011 to May 2016. And from 1991 to 2009, Doug worked with Clean Water Action's New Hampshire program, where he served as their state program director for most of that time. His work there included cleaning up the state's old fossil fuel power plants, combating climate disruption, drinking water protection, coastal water quality efforts, and addressing toxic contamination, particularly mercury and military waste. Doug has also served since 1995 as co-chair of the Restoration Advisory Board for the Superfund mitigation of toxic waste sites at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. And Doug holds a Master's of Science in Environmental Education from Cornell and a BS in Biology from Colorado. Doug, welcome, and thanks again so much for being here.
Yes, thank you, Ed. Hope everybody can hear me well. And I want to thank Friends of Merrymeeting Bay for inviting. We'd hoped to do this early last year, but did get delayed. So I'm glad we were able to fit it in the new year. I realized in that intro, I didn't say much at all about Seacoast Anti-Pollution League or my work with SAPL. The SAPL has actually just celebrated its 50th anniversary, dates back to 1969. I like to say it's older than the Environmental Protection Agency. And as you might guess, it got started when Seabrook was originally announced. I'll say a little more about that later. But I've been with SAPL for 20 years on the board and 10 years about as the director. And I've been involved in nuclear issues for 45 years, I think, since I was in high school, got involved. So I've been following it for a long time and have gathered a lot of info. This talk tonight is meant to be kind of an overview of many of the issues with Seabrook and nuclear power in general. I don't pretend to be able to cover everything and obviously can't go into a great amount of depth. So I hope you'll bear with me. We won't be able to get to all the details, but I hope I can at least pique your interest and have some good follow-up afterward. So I'll begin with the slides here. Just a few basics on nuclear power. For those who aren't that familiar with the history, nuclear power really began as a byproduct of the nuclear weapons development at the end of World War II. And in fact, many of our nuclear plants are actually built on the same model as military reactors that ended up going into submarines and aircraft carriers and so forth. Nuclear power has been in commercial operation for over 60 years now, and it has received hundreds of billions of dollars in federal and state subsidies. There are efforts right now to increase many of those subsidies at the state level to keep plants going. I'll talk about that a bit more later. But suffice to say, it's really done very well on the federal dole, and a lot of us think that's gone on long enough. There are just less than 100 reactors. I believe we're down to 96 now in the country, and they power less than 20% of the US grid, just less than 1/5 of all our power sources. And they've generated over 80,000 tons of spent fuel. This is the high-level radioactive waste that must be kept isolated for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And we add 2,000 tons each year. And of course, there is no long-term solution as we speak. I like to present things in terms of problems and solutions. It's my training as a grassroots activist. In the case of Seabrook and nuclear, there are many problems, as you might guess. And I just want to walk through, I think, about 9 of them here tonight. The first one is a more general problem, and I think is a very important point that our overall problem with our society is not just, climate change or nuclear weapons, nuclear issues, but that we have an unsustainable energy system. And that's kind of a big word, but it basically means we've been reliant on fossil fuels, on materials that are dug up out of the and it's just not sustainable. Obviously leads to climate disruption, air pollution, fuels, and even with nuclear, we have limits to how much uranium. They're not making any more of it. In a sense, it's a fossil fuel. And of course, we have old efficient power plants that will one way or another need to be replaced. And lastly, I like to point out that we have what we call fossilized thinking. A lot of people, cut their teeth back in the 1960s and 70s. Older folks, it's hard to change. And what we're being required to do now is change our whole system as well as our way of thinking. Just a note on the photo, the picture there, that's actually a coal power plant. This is Merrimack Station in Bow. This is the other bad actor in New Hampshire, largest source of carbon emissions in the state. It's hopefully on its last legs, but it is still the last running coal plant in New England without any plan to retire as of yet. But folks are working on that. Now, getting more specifically to nuclear power, one huge problem is, as I've suggested, many of them are getting quite antiquated. And they are dirty. Despite all the hype about nuclear being clean power, it really isn't, even if you're talking about carbon emissions. But Suffice to say that there are many other sources of pollution. We're dealing with an aging infrastructure. Most of the plants in the country are over 30 years old. Many of them are over 40 years old, and there's a few that are actually over 50 years old. We have routine radiation. It's not that well known, but every nuclear plant has to emit radioactive gases so it doesn't blow up, so it doesn't leak uncontrollably. And also solid waste and liquid waste emissions. There is no waste solution, as I mentioned before. They are threatened by the climate as it is changing, especially plants like Seabrook, pictured here, that's on the seacoast, of course. Many others are on lakes and reservoirs and rivers that are also impacted, of course, by climate changes. Nuclear power is too expensive. I'll have a lot more to say a little later about that, but suffice to say, it's proven to be more expensive than originally advertised. And not least, there is the potential for catastrophe. It may be very low, may never happen here in the US, but we all know that we've had several very serious reactions around the world, which I'll talk some about in a minute. And relation to those accidents, we don't have a safe evacuation plan. They do draw up plans, but they are still to be determined if they'll even work at any basic level. So I'll be talking a lot more about each of these issues as we go along. Now, one key issue with plant aging, and this is an effect with all infrastructure, not just nuclear plants, is that over time, they have a pattern of breakdown or problems that represents kind of a bathtub shape. As you can see on the diagram here, on the horizontal axis is time, the vertical axis is frequency of failure. And what we found with nuclear as well as other infrastructure is that during the breaking in period, as the plant or your car, whatever is getting worn in, there's more likely to be problems. Things need to be rejiggered, so forth. And at the tail end of the time, of course, as the plant ages, there's also more likely to be breakdowns. And not surprisingly, most of the serious actions we've had in this country and elsewhere in the world occurred somewhere on this bathtub scale. So you have 3 Mile Island on the left side here. It was only 3 months old when it had its catastrophic failure. Chernobyl wasn't much older than that. And then on the other side, these other plants in the US have had serious accidents. Davis-Besse actually had a corrosion in the top of the reactor that came very, very close to actually blowing a hole in the head of the reactor, if you can believe it. And then even further off this, at the end of the right side, is the Fukushima reactors. The reactor 1, the first one to melt down there, was just about 40 years old when that accident occurred. So this is a common problem with plants, and it's a serious issue, of course, as these plants age. Another serious problem that you perhaps have heard about, if you've been following Seabrook at all, is this issue of concrete degradation, or ASR, alkali silica reaction. And this is due to the structure of the concrete itself. Evidently, they didn't use the right kind of aggregate in making the concrete for the plant. It's a long, sordid story, but suffice to say that the plant owners and regulators realized when they were relicensing the plant that these microcracks were developing in the concrete itself. And this does appear to be associated with water seepage, which is a problem with all concrete, but certainly with a nuclear plant where you have lots of water involved. And the fact that the plant is underground as much as it is above ground. If you look at this diagram here, it doesn't really show to scale or certainly in terms of Seabrook, there's as much depth underground as there is above. And in the case of Seabrook, it's 4 or 5 stories. of underground structures in the foundations that are subject to exposure with groundwater. That's a long story in itself, but it has led to this problem and other related problems with water seepage. And it requires careful monitoring, and it worsens over time. Another organization we're allied with, Citizens Within 10-Mile Radius, or C10. They intervened formally as a legal process with the NRC and the plant owner NextEra to get something done about this ASR problem beyond what the NRC was requiring NextEra to do. And it was a long process, many years of waiting, and they finally got their hearing, and there were some changes made to the process. They are going to have to monitor it more often, but unfortunately for us anyway, it didn't stop the process. It didn't stop the licensing of the plant. It remains to be seen whether it stops the plant itself, because they don't really have a plan B. It could be a long road for them as this ASR problem continues. Another issue with aging is, as I said, the plants don't often hold up as long as they were designed to. This list here is just a partial list of all the plants that didn't make it to the 40-year design life, what their licenses allowed for. You'll notice at the top of the list are 4 of the 9 original reactors for New England. Connecticut Yankee, Millstone 1, Maine Yankee, of course, and Yankee Row in Western Massachusetts. All these plants, as you can see, died before reaching 40. Some didn't even reach 30. And there were fairly predictable reasons why that happened. They'll always say it's due to cost, due to economics, but it's usually because something broke and it just cost too much to fix it. In the case of Maine Yankee, the reactor vessel itself became so brittle that they were concerned that it wouldn't hold up in an accident. And so it died quite a few years prematurely. All in all, there's, I counted 23 reactors around the country that expired prior to their 40-year lifespan. And it works out that of all the plants built prior to 1973, fully half of them, 50% of those plants didn't make it to 40 years. I'm sure the industry will tell you that they're doing them better now. They're building them safer, but this is a common problem, and it's something that we have to be concerned about. Another huge problem, of course, what I think most people relate to is human health impacts, not surprisingly. The issue of radiation exposure, of course, is very concerning, very fraught and controversial. I always like to remind people that the National Academy of Sciences, our premier science body in the US, determined that there is no safe level of radiation. This was determined about 15 years ago, but a lot of people still don't seem to buy it. And so it means that any additional radiation you get can increase your chances of getting cancer or other health effects. Another big issue is that the long-term exposures to these nuclear radionuclides is not well known. There have been some studies both here in the US and in Europe that did determine that there were statistically significant increases in leukemia in particular, childhood cancers, other cancers, but it really hasn't been adequately studied, considering we've had 50 some years to study the problem. Another issue that we've identified on the seacoast here is that where Seabrook is located, that county and the surrounding counties have seen higher cancer rates since the plant was built. And this is a correlation. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the cause, but it is certainly cause for concern. We saw a 20% increase in cancer rates from the 1980s to the 1990s and 2000s. The plant was started in 1990. And we've also seen other data that shows an increase in the rate of childhood cancers in particular around the plant. Now, the headline you see there on the screen, that was actually from a cancer study that was done just a few years ago in 2016. It was determined that there was a statistically significant cancer cluster right in the seacoast area, kind of centered on Rye, New Hampshire, if you know the neighborhood, and half a dozen surrounding towns. And these are for childhood cancers, very rare cancers that shouldn't be showing up as often. To this date, there have been a couple of different commissions put together to study it, but they have not determined really what the cause was. But certainly Seabrook is a possible suspect, given that there has been routine radiation exposure. Another problem, of course, is environmental impacts to the non-human, the biota out there. Huge issue in itself, but I just present you one bit of data. This is from the environmental impact statement just a few years ago in the relicensing of the plant. They have been carefully tabulating all the fish kills that occur when the plant is sucking in water from the Atlantic Ocean. They have a pipe that runs out 3 miles offshore, and it along with the water, it brings in a whole lot of fish, larvae, fish eggs, and other biota, other organisms. And they've been trying to add up the effects. So the first chart here, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but the average down at the bottom, and that is in millions of fish larvae. These are not adult fish, but obviously hope to grow into adult fish. And the total over this period of time they were studying was 269 million larvae. And you can see the individual fish like winter flounder and herring and others that you may be familiar with. Some of these, of course, are commercial species, and it's certainly a loss to the fishing industry as well as the environment as a whole. On the second chart here, you can see the, again, just a small sampling of the fish they've studied, and you're seeing thousands of fish every year that are impinged, and that basically means they got caught in a degrading, so they don't go into the plant itself. And again, you're seeing huge numbers, 20,000 and some every year that, again, are being killed. They assume that anyone that's being entrained or impinged will die due to all the stresses of going down this tunnel. So that's just one of the environmental impacts, but it was one that the EPA, when they were reviewing the environmental impact statement, thought was, in their terminology, moderate to large in impact. It was the only impact on the environment that they determined to be large for certain species like the rainbow herring and one other one in particular that are fished commercially. And they also determined that it costs millions of dollars in terms of lost product, if you will, if these fish were to be caught for human consumption. Now, moving on to accidents, of course, the worst one that we've seen over many years is Chernobyl. It's just coming up on the 35th anniversary, and people are still dying from the exposure from Chernobyl. It spread throughout Europe. I'll show you on a map in a second showing that effect. And they are still using plants very similar to Chernobyl in Russia. I believe there are 9 that are still operating. They claim they fixed them and they aren't going to do what it did, but it was certainly a horrendous catastrophe for that region. This map you probably can't see terribly well, but Chernobyl, Ukraine is right in the center here where these darker colors are. And much of the pollution, the radiation traveled north and west, much towards Scandinavia, countries like Finland and Sweden. Norway got some of the worst impacts, even as far as Scotland. They were seeing high levels of radiation. And to this day, there are many types of plants and animals that it's not recommended to eat because of the ongoing radiation, the fallout from Chernobyl. And of course, the area right around the plant has been closed off for decades now and is a wasteland. So this is an ongoing catastrophe. And it's been determined by at least one researcher that is right on the ground in Russia, passed on, but he and other researchers totaled up all the cumulative effects of Chernobyl. They determined that nearly 1 million people have died. Now, the official reports you'll see out of the UN and other sources will maybe put it in the thousands. Some people say it's only a few dozen, but clearly there's been a much greater impact than was first understood. And because of the latency period of radiation of cancers, it could take many more decades before we know the full impact. Moving on to Fukushima, we're coming up on the 10th anniversary of that catastrophe. These are the 4 reactors of Fukushima Daiichi, and 3 of them, in addition to melting down, had hydrogen explosions, which caused the roofs to blow off. And we have an overhead close-up here of the reactor 3, and you can see that the whole upper part of the reactor is just destroyed. This blue spot in the center here to the left is actually the spent fuel pool. These type of reactors, much like Vermont Yankee, in fact, the reactor pools are right in the reactor building itself. And when the roof blows off, the reactor pool is exposed. And this is a very serious issue. It could have been much, much worse. And for many years, we didn't know how bad it would really be. But I'll be saying a little more about spent fuel later. But this is a side view of reactor 4, which also suffered an explosion. The spent fuel pool is up here. You can see some workers, hopefully well wrapped up in radiation suits, trying to deal with the problems there. They were concerned that the whole pool would spill over outside of the reactor. Let me go back. And it proved a very difficult problem. And fortunately, they have gotten that under control. But as you may know, Fukushima is an ongoing disaster in terms of continued contaminated water and not really having a solution for cleaning up the mess. One of the key issues with any nuclear reactor, and particularly after these accidents, is how to get away from it when it, has an accident. And so in its wisdom, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission determined that after 3 Mile Island, that there should be a 10-mile radius of evacuation planning. This is the Seabrook neighborhood. This is Kittery, Maine, and Portsmouth up here, and then Newburyport and other towns down here. And so there are, I think, about 15 towns within the 10-mile radius of Seabrook in the center. And these all had to have evacuation plans, but due to the geography, the number of people involved, and many other factors, it's very concerning that this evacuation plan may not really do the job. Now, at Fukushima, when they had the accident and determined how far the radiation traveled, it turned out that their evacuation planning, I believe 20 kilometers originally, wasn't adequate to deal with all the radiation. The brighter colors, you might guess, are where there's higher radiation effects. And they found that to the northwest. Fortunately, it didn't blow to the southeast because down here is Tokyo. But quite a bit of the countryside did get contaminated, as well as the ocean, of course. And they determined that the evacuation planning needed to be a larger area. The US government, in its wisdom, decided that folks, American citizens ought to get at least 50 miles away from the accident. It seems that if that was good enough for Fukushima, it ought to be good enough for our country as well. But to this date, no US reactor has a 50-mile zone. This map shows if you were to expand that evacuation zone to 50 miles, it would extend almost to Portland, Maine, and down to downtown Boston. So you can imagine it would be a much more difficult problem. These figures up here show the numbers within the 10-mile radius, only 100,000 people, 120,000, but 50 miles, you're talking 4.3 million people that would need to be addressed in the evacuation. So that's worth a whole other discussion itself, but it's suffice to say it's a big problem and would certainly be a headache if there was a significant accident. Now, the other big factor, as I mentioned before, is radioactive waste. This picture depicts the actual spent fuel pool at Seabrook. The water actually glows that blue color because of the radiation involved, and it has to be kept under 20 feet of water so that the radiation does not escape. The water absorbs it. It has to be kept cool. They have to keep pumping water through it. It has to be shielded. And again, the radiation, the material is dangerous for tens of thousands of years. Now, a much better way of storing this radioactive material, once it's cooled down a certain level, is to put it into what they call dry cask storage. These are very large casks. You've probably perhaps seen pictures of them that are dry in the sense they don't have liquid in them, but they are sealed and they cool through airflow. They are retrievable in the sense that if it was to be moved, you could move the material in them. And they are safer certainly than being in these pools of water. As I mentioned, it appears to be the best solution we have right now for storing this waste. But we and many environmental groups feel that there isn't adequate protection. They need to be much hardened structures to protect these sites. And just to show what Seabrook's spent fuel cask area looks like, this is a former parking lot actually at the entrance of the plant. And there are about a dozen of these mausoleum type structures that these vaults that the waste casks are put into. Much more of the waste is still in the reactor building itself in the spent fuel pools, but eventually much more of it will be transferred to this site. As you can see, it's very open. There's just a chain link fence, concrete pad. It's really open to the elements. And for security purposes, it's certainly not the best arrangement. Certainly after 9/11, people are much more attuned to the idea that, you know, you could drop an airplane or a missile or something into that, and it could cause a lot of problems. And another point is that it is awfully close to the shoreline. This is the salt marsh in Seabrook, Hampton Harbor. They say it's about 22, 23 feet above average sea level, mean sea level, but we don't think that's good enough. And certainly as sea level rises, that could be more of an issue. Just for comparison, oh, and then this is a view of these vaults being delivered on a barge. They're so big they couldn't transport them over the highways. They had to bring them in by barge through Hampton Harbor. So it gives you an idea of the scale involved. And just for comparison, this is the main Yankee storage site. So we said the plant was shut down in 1996. They've been stored there for 25 years in these casks. There's about 550 tons of radioactive waste. I believe it's at a somewhat higher elevation, but again, still open to the elements, just a chain link fence separating it. And this is a map showing the transport routes. If the spent fuel was to be sent to Yucca Mountain, that was the old plan. They sometimes refer to as the Screw Nevada plan, because Nevada didn't have a lot of votes in Congress, and they got stuck with it. But that has been stalled. But in any case, environmentalists have referred to this as the mobile Chernobyl plan because of the potential for transporting this waste to result in accidents. There's routine radiation emitted from these casts. And of course, if they got into an accident, a fire, etc., you could have much more serious complications. And these are all the nuclear reactors around the country, many in the Chicago area, the New York metropolitan area, and of course, New England, that all would need to be shipped across the country. There's kind of an interim plan right now to ship them to West Texas and eastern New Mexico. And that's a private operation, but the federal government seems intent on moving it forward. We, of course, don't like that any better than the Yucca Mountain plan. And it's, again, only an interim solution, basically building a bigger parking lot to store the waste. So this is certainly a problematic situation. And of course, the final solution, if you will, was intended to be Yucca Mountain. This is the entranceway. They spent billions of dollars building this facility. And it's determined that there is water seepage, that the site is subject to potential leakage, and they really don't think it, many people don't think it's a good solution geologically, let alone politically. There is a alternate plan that was proposed about 25 years ago, where they would store the waste in granite. And being the granite state, New Hampshire, one of the sites was in Hillsborough, New Hampshire. There were also a couple of sites proposed in eastern Maine on the Passamaquoddy and Penobscot Indian lands. They love to dump things on the Indians. I mean, that's just our history, of course. Fortunately, both of these proposals were shot down, ran out of town, whatever. But they could resurface, obviously, with Yucca Mountain kind of kaput. Moving on to climate disruption. Again, speaking of the impacts of climate on the plant itself, this map shows Seabrook here, where my pointer is, just west of Hampton Harbor, Hampton Seabrook, huge estuary. As sea level rises, and it's predicted not even a worst case scenario now, 3 feet or more, 1 meter over the next 100 years, it could be as much as 2 meters and perhaps more. We could see this whole area inundated, many of the approachways to the plant, including Route 1 here, and of course the coastal areas would be affected. Hampton Beach itself could disappear. It is a barrier island, so, you know, things change when the climate changes. And that could seriously affect the future of the nuclear plant, of course, and the waste stored there. There's also concern about more significant storms. You know, we could see a hurricane coming up our way, or multiple storms, precipitation. There are many different factors. And after Fukushima, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission did require plants to look at some of these water regime changes, but they did not eventually require them to do it. They made any changes we have now. For its parts, Seabrook came up with a plan that called for certain doors being reinforced to hold back the water, and the pre-positioning of sandbags. They're literally sandbagging the issue by saying that that would be a solution. Now, we get some idea of the effect of this by looking at a plant out west. This is the Fort Calhoun plant in Nebraska. Back in 2011, the Missouri River went over its banks, and flooded the plant. And they thought it came within just a few feet of actually flowing into the reactor building itself. It was a huge mess. They spent millions of dollars trying to reinforce and fix the plant afterward, but they eventually closed it down. So it's no longer operating. But that is a problem when plants have to be close to water to be able to cool their reactors. Just moving on to some economics, again, worthy of a whole other talk, but nuclear has proven to be not as economical as originally proposed. For new nuclear plants, this data is some 12 years old, it's a bit dated, but the ISO New England, the group that follows that plans the grid in New England, determined that nuclear was on the high end of cost. If you were to build a new nuclear plant, that is, the only one higher was photovoltaics. We'll see in a minute how much they have come down in cost while nuclear has continued to go up. But you get a relative sense. Wind power, which we'll be talking about a lot in a few minutes, is much cheaper, particularly on land, and combined cycle gas, which is what many of our plants in New England and elsewhere have gone to, is cheaper still. But obviously that is affected by the availability of gas. And so we'll see, as you might guess, renewables have come on in a big way since then. This is a comparison of the cost of solar, this dark graph, excuse me. The dark line is the price of solar, and it has come down steadily, and it's come down even more since this was put together. And the price of nuclear, as I said, has gone up and up and up. And at some point they cross paths. X marks the spot. That was in 2010. So for the last 10 years, on average, solar has been cheaper than nuclear. So not surprisingly, they're not building many new nuclear plants. This chart on the left shows the, again, the price of solar coming down. This is more recent data. It's actually come down as low as the price of wind power, whereas nuclear has gone up in price. And then, not surprisingly, solar and other renewables have been increasing dramatically in recent years, whereas nuclear and, of course, coal have bottomed out. We're actually, of course, seeing less nuclear now overall, certainly in the US, but even around the world. So these are the trends that we're seeing, and it doesn't look good for nuclear for sure. So we finally get to the solution. I refer to the 4 S's: sustainability, safety, security, and sanity. And you know, it's a matter of coming up with sustainable sources. And fortunately, we have been seeing them coming on dramatically in recent years. And we can also now project that we will be able to run our whole energy system on renewable sources exclusively. One project called the Solutions Project out of California determined that by 2050, we could be seeing the whole United States running on 100% wind, water, and solar. Doesn't even include biomass, you know, burning wood, which is an issue certainly in New Hampshire and Maine. Doesn't require huge batteries, doesn't require new technology. Obviously, technology will improve, batteries will get built. So this is, I think, a conservative approach. And you can find these charts on their website, solutionsproject.org. They have one for each state. So you can look up the one for Maine or New Hampshire or so forth. You know, it's a projection. It's obviously not the ultimate solution, but it gives you a sense of what the potential is. I just point out that wind power in the Maine one, I believe they have 35% for each. So most of Maine's power could come from wind, and most of that, at least half of that, from offshore wind. I think it'll probably be even more than that. But that certainly is a big factor for New England and where we should be heading. And of course, we need to connect up the grid better to have a smarter grid in which all these different sources can be maintained and coordinated. And models have been developed to do this with computers. We can do a much better job of getting these sources to work together. And you can even involve, you know, household solar, car batteries, all kinds of facilities can be plugged into the grid so that you could have a much more resilient, much more diverse grid. Again, another big topic, but just briefly, that's where we need to go. So New Hampshire, Maine actually kind of led the way, and what got me interested in this topic. They put together a task force called by the governor back in 2008, and they produced this report in 2009 that determined that there was a huge potential for offshore wind in particular, and that they thought that 5,000 megawatts, which is more than double the current use of electric power in Maine, enough to run basically both Maine and New Hampshire, could be developed by 2030. As you might guess, that target has been shifted somewhat because of politics. A certain governor stood in the way of much of this development for several years, but it is getting back on track, as you'll see in a minute. When this report came out, it definitely piqued my interest because one of the researchers announced that there was enough power offshore of Maine through wind power to replace 150 nuclear plants. And that sounded pretty good to me. You know, we only have 100 in the country, so you could replace a whole lot of coal plants as well. And so that's pretty intriguing, and we'll see why that's the case. And this plan also determined that between onshore and offshore wind and other renewable sources, we could run the whole state of Maine, including switching over transportation to all electric, home heating to all electric, or heat pumps, and run the whole state, and even have some left over to export to other states. Now, of course, state of Maine and other New England states are all on one grid, so it isn't like it's all going to stay in Maine in any case. But the point is that there is potential resource to be able to do that. At about the same time, the U.S. Department of Energy put out a report for the whole country that determined that there were thousands, tens of thousands of megawatts in offshore wind available. This is a real groundbreaking report in really showing how things could look, and that the potential was so huge. Even off of New Hampshire with our tiny little coast, there are about 2,000 megawatts. And they determined in a subsequent report that it would be even economically feasible, not just, you know, theoretically, just in our short coastline, as we'll see in a minute here. So here's a map of the entire US. The brighter colors, you might guess, are the areas offshore that are best for wind. It turns out the northern latitudes are much better for wind, the northeast and the northwest. And most of the whole interior of the US is actually much less productive for wind. There's just one area in southeastern Wyoming that is even comparable to most of the areas offshore, just 10, 20 miles offshore. And so it really behooves us to tap into this offshore resource. And of course, most of the people live on the coast, East Coast and West Coast as well. So it just has huge, huge potential. And since those reports were developed, the organization, the federal agency, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, has identified lease sites for offshore wind. One of the most significant, of course, just south of the Cape, here south of Martha's Vineyard, a little closer inset here on that site. And all of the New England states that are looking to tap into offshore wind currently are utilizing this one area south of the Cape. And so that's, you know, really huge game changer for our region. And of course, all the other New England states, or all the other East Coast states, except for Maine and New Hampshire and Georgia, have looked into offshore wind, have either identified a site or done research, set up a task force. According to BOEM regulations, each state or region has to put together a task force that would involve all the local, state, tribal, and federal agencies involved to sort out the issues and get a better sense of what's feasible. So that's been a really important process. And I'm happy to say that New Hampshire and Maine just in the last 2 years agreed to have a task force, and they held a meeting last year. With COVID, of course, things have been delayed as far as upcoming meetings, but it was a big step forward to get the states to sign on to this process. And as I was saying, for all of New England, we've seen a huge increase in proposals. It turns out that just offshore wind alone is now over 13,000 megawatts. That's about half of the total peak capacity of New England, the whole New England grid that could be gotten from offshore wind if all these proposals go forward. It's not clear that all of them will get built, but a significant number are, and it's been really driven by states requiring that their utilities purchase a certain amount of power, with Massachusetts, of course, leading the way with several thousand megawatts already procured. And so what the ISO New England regional grid is seeing this huge number of offshore wind development. 68% of its total new capacity is looking to come from wind, and most of that from offshore. I do note that there's quite a bit also being proposed in Maine, and I'm sure people have issues with some of those onshore sites. But again, offshore is proving to be a much better solution and much larger potential. Just to give you an idea of what the available area, this is the 50-mile zone out to here from the coast of Maine. As you might guess, the areas in darker color are higher potential. The Department of Energy, I believe, determines red is excellent and orange is very good. But anywhere in this area would be good for offshore wind. And Maine is particularly good in that much of this best area is within 10 to 20 miles, even closer to the coast, although they'll certainly try to limit that being too close to the shore. Now, New Hampshire has a different picture. This is much bigger scale. This is Portsmouth down to Seabrook down here. And we have this odd little pie slice of land that is actually in the state waters, if you will. Now, 3 miles offshore, this green line here is actually what's federal waters, more than 3 miles. And that means that the federal agencies really call the shots if you're more than 3 miles out, whether you're in Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts. So most of the Gulf of Maine, most of the areas that would be developed are going to be done in federal waters by these regulated by the federal agencies. But even in New Hampshire's very small little slice of offshore real estate, it's been determined that there's about 2,000 megawatts. That's more than Seabrook has capacity at 1,250 megawatts. So, you know, we could see potentially enough wind power just off our shores to replace Seabrook alone, let alone all these others being developed. As of today, of course, we only have one wind farm off our coast. You've probably heard about the Block Island wind farm, just 5 turbines, 30 megawatts. But it certainly set a good precedent for moving forward on offshore wind. And you can now get tours of the site because it's become a tourist attraction. The Gulf of Maine, we've had a very interesting research project by the University of Maine you may be familiar with called Volturn US. This was a 1/8 scale floating turbine that was set up in Penobscot Bay off of Castine. And it ran for, I believe, 1.5 years, generating electricity. It withstood a major nor'easter storm. And you can actually watch a video on their website of how well how stable it was in the water. Again, this is a floating system, which appears in Maine and New Hampshire to be the main way to go, if you will, for offshore wind, because the waters are too deep generally, unless you want to be really close to shore, which nobody wants them real close to shore. So floating systems are going to be the future. And they are testing a full-scale model, I think in the next couple of years is the target now, off of Monhegan Island, just south of Monhegan. It's again within state waters, so they don't have the feds to deal with. But this is a drawing of what that turbine will look like. It'll be 10 to 12 megawatts in one turbine, and we'll see in a minute how large these turbines are getting to be. And I should mention the state of Maine is, the state government has announced an intention to build a actual wind farm of about a dozen turbines as the next step, and to have it up and running by 2025. And that would be kind of a research facility to determine the best way to go about doing these floating farms. But we have a lot of previous results to go on, in that other countries have developed these offshore floating turbines. This one was built in Norway. It's on a single spar, I guess it's called, that floats under the water. This one is by a company in, sorry about the jumping around, a company out of Seattle, Washington, actually, Principal Power, but it was built by a Spanish company, and is, or excuse me, Portuguese, and it's offshore of Portugal. And then the last one here, very interestingly, was built by the Japanese. It's a 7 megawatt turbine, and it was placed off of Fukushima. Not coincidentally, I think the Japanese have kind of learned their lesson, or at least they're realizing that they really need to go with renewable sources in the future, and they've proposed many thousands of megawatts of offshore wind, of course, to replace their nuclear plants as well as oil and coal plants. So that's a good start on that technology. And then we're seeing these much larger turbines being built. The largest to date is the Haliade X turbine that's built by GE, General Electric. You know, they're doing good things. They also built a lot of nuke plants in their previous life, including actually the Fukushima plant was a GE model. But they're getting much bigger into offshore wind. And this one is a 12 megawatt turbine. You might notice it's onshore, but it's just a prototype to test out the technology. The next ones will be offshore in the next couple of years, and they're now saying they can rate it up to 14 megawatts. And basically, the sky's the limit. I mean, these are 800 feet tall. They have this huge rotor span. This other one is a Vestas plant that's about 10 megawatts, and others are developing large ones as well. So we're seeing just much, much greater capacities, and that bodes well for the future of offshore wind. I do want to mention, since Peace Action Maine is one of the co-sponsors of this event, and again, another reason I got involved with the offshore wind issue is the fact that the Ports and Naval Shipyard is a strategic location right smack in the middle of Portsmouth Harbor that could potentially be utilized for offshore wind development. And somewhat surprisingly, the folks that run the shipyard have actually offered to provide some of their facilities, at least for research and construction purposes, to folks like the University of New Hampshire. I don't believe they've taken them up on it yet, but potentially we could see parts of the shipyard being utilized for this purpose. Obviously has very easy access to the open ocean and deep water. They have dry dock facilities and warehouses and so forth. And as a peacenik, I would certainly like to see the shipyard in the future being used for something more peaceful, something more useful than weapons of mass destruction. And so we'll see if that happens. But a commission that was set up by the New Hampshire legislature recently is charged with determining what role the shipyard could play in offshore wind development. So stay tuned, that may develop over time. So getting back to nuclear, we have to ask whether the sun is setting on Seabrook and nuclear power in general. As I've said, the economics and the politics are not working out well for it, despite the best efforts of state and federal agencies to prop them up with huge subsidies. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which I haven't said much about, but they're one of the best examples of what's called a captured regulator. They are actually funded by the nuclear industry, by fees they charge to the nuclear plants. And they have shown no real independence as far as determining whether nuclear is safe and sustainable for the future. Some of you may know the book, The Confessions of a Nuclear Regulator by a former NRC chairman. We had him speak up this way last year, and it's well worth reading, a real inside story on how the NRC operates and how it really mismanages the situation from a regulatory standpoint. But anyway, that's kind of the picture as we see it from here on the Artsy coast. And again, offshore wind, other renewable resources do promise a new age in energy production and hopefully a much more benign future for our region and for the world. So I think I'll stop there. Just pointing out that we need to continue engaging our state and federal and local officials to make this happen. Maine as well as New Hampshire need to get on the ball with requiring that offshore wind and other renewable resources get built. And we need to be working together to make sure we have the best plan going forward. There is a regional coalition that's just coming together in the last year or so called
Doug, we lost you. Are you back again, Doug? Doug, you want to try to cut your video feed and see if we can get your audio back? Yeah, I'm afraid we lost Doug, and I'm not sure. We'll see if he can come back in. And for those people who might have questions, if we get Doug back into the room, soon we'll be able to answer those questions. If he's got offline for any reason, we can collect the questions and have them answered offline.
Yeah, hey, Martha, just while we're waiting for Doug, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, just wanted to thank you again and thank Arthur for managing the questions and for putting this on technically and offering us the opportunity in Peace Action Maine. And of course, Doug. Yeah, I think someone asked a question, but this is being recorded. In theory, I'm doing it. In theory, you're doing it. And in theory, it'll be up on our Friends of Merrymeeting Bay website in a speaker series recording section at some point here. And I'll thank Martin McDonough for helping make that possible. He's on here as well. So we'll see how the rest of it works. And I think that was a great talk. I hope Doug can come back. I'm not sure what happened either. So.
Hi, I'm just wondering if I could just say hello to the group. I'm Sarah Dunmez from Dublin, New Hampshire, and I'm on the board of C10, which is the organization that Doug referred to that has been involved in working very closely through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Atomic Safety and Licensing Board to try to ensure that adequate attention is being paid to the concrete degradation of the Seabrook nuclear power plant. And we did manage to get a lot of additional attention and regulations placed on Next Era for monitoring the concrete degradation. But since that's been one of C10's major focuses recently, I do just want to let you know that that is a very acute situation and one that is irreversible. So the concrete is going to continue to degrade, and the micro cracking that it leads to is pervasive throughout the plant. It's in the spent fuel pool as well as in the container dome, and really the plant is riddled with this concrete degradation. And I guess I just also wanted to let you know that this work is really important because Seabrook is the first and only nuclear power plant in the nation known to have ASR. We assume that it is present in many of the other nuclear power plants as well. It's a very common condition in roadways and in bridges, and it's known to have occurred in a couple of other nuclear plants overseas, which led to their closure. So we think that this may also be we hope that this is a step toward regulations that would apply to all of the nuclear fleet in the nation and lead to additional scrutiny for other nuclear power plants. So if you're interested in any of that, c10.org, and we'd welcome any of your questions or participation in any of our events. So thanks so much for putting this on. I learned a lot. I'm very hopeful at the wind that Doug has presented, and just grateful to you for putting on this talk tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sarah, can you identify, is it C10? How is that spelled? Can you enter that
Yeah,
into the chat?
I'll put that in the chat, absolutely.
Sarah, have there been any life expectancy conclusions that have come out of the ASR issue? How that
That's such an interesting question, trying to project the future of it. Not really.
Okay.
Not really. We've had the great good luck to work with an expert in this field who's a professor at UC Boulder. His name is Victor Salma. But it has not, life expectancy implies that it would get, the cracking would be so bad that they'd have to shut it down. And of course, that's been our big question too, is, what is that point? And needless to say, the NRC hasn't been interested in trying to project that or ask Next Era to project that. So I don't think we know that for sure, no.
Okay, thank you.
I've got 3 people in a stack. It looks like Vance, Rick, and Paul. Did you have a question, Paul Kane? Well, I don't hear Paul right now. So go ahead, Rick, and then Vance first, and then Rick.
Well, hello, Rick Maynard, Manchester, New Hampshire, IBW electrician, nuclear certified electrician, and I actually worked on Seabrook recently where we took and elevated the main breaker, and the underground piping going up to that the main breaker for connecting the plant to the grid. They put it about 15 feet up in the air. All the underground piping leaving the control center to that main breaker was really deteriorated to the point that you couldn't guarantee.
We just lost your sound, Rick.
Well, the host muted me.
Oh,
So basically, that's what I'm just saying. Worse than the concrete is the underground piping and the metallic piping connecting to all the objects in the electrical system. It's what determines your grounding and your feedback mechanism for overcurrent protection. So, there was where they connected to the metal troughs where the pipes came in underneath, they were totally not connected. If they touched, it was by accident.
yeah. So the more current, the more galvanic corrosion that's happening there. Yeah.
So Vance, looks like you're next, Vance.
Okay, well, if Don's not on, I was just going to ask a question of, there always seems to be some, you know, some complaint about any renewable proposal, and I didn't know if Doug was aware of any, potential objections to offshore wind. So if if he heard that or he gets back, I'd be interested in his response. And I will, just on this topic, doesn't come up often, but I actually grew up very near 3 Mile Island, and I got 3 days my senior year in high school because we all had to stay indoors. I got 3 days off of school from that.
So that's really interesting, Lance. I think what we'll do is try to relay the questions to Doug, and when he has a chance, he'll answer us, and then we'll try to get the answers shared back onto wherever we post the film. Is that okay? Oh,
Yes.
here's Doug. Oh, you want to ask it again? Here's Doug.
Martha, have you tried to call Doug?
He's back. He's
He's
back
coming
on,
in right now.
sort of. I don't know if you have to do something to get him out of the waiting room, Martha.
He's joining now. It just takes a while.
I can admit. Yeah. Okay. You there, Doug?
Martha, I could offer a comment about Maine Yankee.
One minute here. Here's Doug. So you can go ahead, Rob, about your main Yankee.
Oh, I was going to say, when I was hearing about the size of the emergency evacuation plans, considering 10 miles, 20 miles, 50 miles, Maine Yankee had a 6 mile radius that was pretty much standard industry at that time. In the summer of, I think, 1976, I spent the whole summer um, going around interviewing all the boards of selectmen of all the towns, the hospital administrators, the Coast Guard, the state police, and anyone, and at that time what they were called was civil defense officers, to find out what they knew about the emergency evacuation plan for Maine Yankee. And the answer was a resounding amount of silence, because although this plan existed on paper, none of the local municipal officials or people to play a role in the event of an accident had any clue that there was even a plan or that they had any role in it. As a result of that report, working with Ralph Nader and Public Citizen, we filed a show cause petition with the NRC to shut down Maine Yankee on the basis that it had no effective emergency evacuation plan. And of course, it didn't get anywhere with the NRC. But then we proceeded with the State Public Utilities Commission on the basis that Maine required safe and dependable service, and argued that Maine Yankee without an effective plan was not safe. And thereupon began a process where they started installing sirens. And you may recall, if you were around Wiscasset before the plant shut down, there were a lot of big horns set up on very tall telephone poles in some of those surrounding communities, all of which was designed to alert people if there was an accident. And whether or not they knew where to go, I don't know, because with the Maine coastline in that area, it's very jagged, and there aren't a lot of straight routes from A to B. But so the fact that they've expanded out, from what Doug said, to larger safety zones is a good thing, but it certainly complicates the idea of evacuating anybody.
Sorry to get cut off, folks. I had to reboot my computer. It always seems to take quite a while, but I trust everybody saw my last slide or got to see all the
That
go to
was
the presentation.
the sunset slide, was that?
Yeah, I had couple more, mainly just with websites and such.
No.
At the end, I can
Nope.
put that up if folks want to see
That-
that information.
That would be good. The sunset slide was the last one we saw. We do have an outstanding question from Vance, which was about possible environmental issues with offshore wind, if you wanted to speak to some of those.
Sure.
Well, and then Doug, when you got cut off, you were just starting to say a coalition is now forming.
Yes. Okay. Well, that's a good segue. Can folks see this now?
Yes,
Okay, good.
There you go. Great.
Yeah, so yes, there's a coalition throughout New England called New England for Offshore Wind, and it includes many national and regional groups, as well as some from state of Maine, like Natural Resource Council of Maine, Maine Conservation Voters, University of Maine. SAPL is on board, and dozens of more groups. So if you go to their website, newenglandforoffshorewind.org, it's listed down at the bottom there. You should be able to read more about it, and your group could join it. And you know, more the merrier. There's going to need to be a big effort to push. You know, given that the existing proposals have been getting some flack. I didn't get into all that, but as you can imagine, the fishing industry is pushing back, and there have been some squabbles over the actual layout of these new wind farms. And of course, if you have questions, other things you'd like to contact me for, we have our office phone number as well as my email. Email is probably more immediate, direct for me if you want an answer quickly, but be glad to stay in touch with people. But I'd be glad to take other questions now.
So there was a question, Doug, from Vance about wildlife effects or environmental effects, and if you could speak to any of those possible issues with offshore wind.
Well, I did try to touch on some of that. With offshore wind,
Yes.
as opposed to the nuclear. Yeah.
Birds, bats, fish, you know.
Yeah, and that's one reason I like to point out that groups like National Wildlife Federation, also Audubon, have signed on to offshore wind because it's pretty well thought that the potential impacts to marine life in the ocean is much lower than what we find in terrestrial settings, and obviously, you know, you can cite them in areas that are going to be less impactful to begin with, you know, not on the flyways of birds and so forth. But it turns out that most of the offshore area, you know, more than 10, 15 miles out, you don't see a lot of bird life in particular. They like to stay close to shore. Certainly we need to be concerned about the right whales in particular, endangered species. But most environmental groups feel that this is doable, that we can work out the differences. And that's one of the reasons, I don't know if I got to it yet in my last few comments, but the state of Maine has been proposing to build a kind of a research wind farm of about a dozen turbines. And part of the reason there would be to determine the impacts on fisheries and wildlife and so forth. So, you know, there has been a lot of research already, but certainly Europe is way ahead of us in all this. You know, I think in New England and around the country, people are very sensitive to the impacts, and again, much lower than the impacts from other sources. In my regular slideshow on offshore wind, I have a chart that shows the magnitude of difference in impacts from power lines to buildings, just windows, you know, and of course, domestic cats are a huge source of mortality among birds. And so, you know, I'm a cat lover too, so I don't want to blame the cats, but when you look at the scale of the impacts, offshore wind and onshore wind are much lower in terms of total mortality. And it's getting better and better. They're developing techniques in order to scare off the birds, if you will, and bats, other creatures. And also the larger the turbine, it turns out they move slower. You know, it's not like a big Cuisinart in the air. It's a very slow process, and it's thought that most of the birds will be able to adapt to that change in regime. It's not like having a large concrete wall 1,000 feet in the air that you got to run into and don't have much choice in the matter. So anyway, that's generally the thinking on wildlife impacts.
I guess Steve Pelletier, one of our members, just popped up something on the chat, but he's done a lot of this work for quite a few years now, and certainly can welcome to jump in, Steve, if you want to say anything about insects or bats.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah, by chance, we've over the number of years we've done quite a bit of work on offshore bats. Just after doing a lot of studies on terrestrial wind power sites for birds and bats, and that meant a lot of just everything from involving radar and acoustic studies, and a lot of post construction sites where you're actually walking around underneath turbines. And so the idea of trying to understand what kind of fatalities, what kind of risk were offshore has been a huge problem for both the Department of Energy and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Department of Energy gave us a substantial grant back a number of years ago where we conducted studies up and down the coast, actually from just about shy of Canada all the way down into North Carolina, where in that particular study, we were looking for the influence of migrating bats. Was following a lot of different types of avian studies. The short answer here is we were actually ended up being contracted to conduct the first offshore studies at Block Island. So that was conducted for about 4 years, where we've got both radar and let me see if I can do this right here. I'll put this up. Start video. So long and short is we ended up putting both different types of radar and cameras, thermal and regular cameras and acoustic recorders on a couple of the turbines out on Block Island. And so, as predicted, there are seasonal times for bats that they're coming through. It's during migration. Mostly it's in that late July, mid-July through mid-September period, where most bats are migrating through. And you'll get quite a few numbers out there, even quite a distance. And Block Island's only is only a couple miles off the island. And we were getting plenty of bats out there. There's plenty of bats much farther out offshore. The risk is generally limited because of the timing, but there is some risk. And one of the concerns that you would have, though, is that some of these turbines, and if you're talking about some of these turbines that are getting to be like 15 megawatt turbines, and they're getting pretty high and they're reaching higher, and their rotor swept zone is much larger. Frankly, the trade-off is it's a much better energy source in the end of the day than just about anything else we've got available to us. And there was going to be some kind of risk, some kind of cost, no matter what we do, unless we decide just to turn things all off, which nobody seems to be interested in doing. So when you look at the big trade-offs, there are risks, but some of those risks can be actually minimized by understanding how those birds and bats are moving at certain times of the year, because they're only going to be moving under certain wind speeds, under certain conditions, at certain seasonal times. And you start adding these things up, and you can really minimize the risk by curtailing your turbines. You don't have to do it for long periods of time. There's a number of things we're doing if we're only become a little bit more smarter and actually spend a little bit more time looking to see when these critters are around, and we can even do this job better. So I just want to say, Doug, you did excellent talk. You're on, everything's on the right thing. I've gotten into the weeds on this stuff for quite some time, so it's nice to see another advocate for it, so.
Mhm.
I
I figure there's a lot of folks in Maine have been doing a lot of work because this has been progressing for many years, and notably the University of Maine. So I'm glad to hear that folks are following it.
We had actually put the acoustic detectors out on the, not only at Castine, but on that floating 1/8 model, And again, no big surprises because bats are, even with white nose syndrome and a number of reduced bats, there's still quite a few bats that are out there. And, but it's interesting that the agencies have kind of just moved away. And I don't know if it was just the last couple of administrations that have been looking at it, but it doesn't seem to be, as much of a risk. Right whales are rightfully a huge concern still, though. I'll take enough time. Thanks.
Yard, are you up next? Do you have some time for your comments?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
I'm looking for Yarda. She had a comment in the Yarda Hutar.
Yeah, I just
sorry.
thought that the coalition between the Maine and New Hampshire is absolutely necessary for both the power station and the shipyard.
Yeah, we're really glad to see it's really the Federal Bureau. I mean, it's hard to believe they actually are getting something right on the federal level, despite, Trump administration. But even there, they realize that offshore wind is a huge potential. It's part of the, all the above approach. And they're also seeing that regional cooperation is certainly key. And we saw that certainly with the Cape. It bodes well for the Gulf of Maine that obviously the three states should work together and that they're, literally all in the same room. Remains to be seen, specific facilities and which states are going to get more connections. But we do have the infrastructure out there to be able to do much more, and I think we'll be seeing some rapid development in coming years.
Wonderful. I think that we're about to close down the meeting unless there are any other questions. Ed, do you have any final comments? Thank you, Doug.
Yeah, I think I was going to say we should close it out soon because people are drifting off and we've been on the air for a while. So Doug, you were off the air when I thanked you, but it's been a wonderful presentation. It will get up on our website. Thank Martha and Arthur again and everyone who came. We really appreciate it. I think it went really well. Yeah, check the website. I don't know, within a week or so, and hopefully it'll be there. And great slides. And again, it was wonderful. So thank you, and hope to see you next month with the rainbow smelt, which I noticed came up on one of your slides as being sucked into the nuclear inferno there.
Very, very timely discussion.
Right.
Well, thanks again for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Night.
Right.
Okay,
So,
bye now.
see you, Vance. See you, everybody. Okay. See if we can close out without